Thanks everyone for coming to another thinking space. I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and extend that respect to the traditional owners of the land wherever you may be joining us online, people who have joined us on Zoom. Today we have Professor Pritchard here, now very in School of Geosciences, to talk to us about coastal multifunctional rural landscapes. So won't waste any time. Take it away, Bill. I sure can.
Hey, thanks everyone, and thanks Jamie, and thanks to my colleagues here in Sydney University. It's great to see a number of you here and a lot of people online. I know the invite for this talk went out through various networks in the Department of Primary Industries, so I know we've got a lot of public servants listening in, which is great. Someone online, I think, has their microphone not muted and we're getting some feedback. Everyone online can check, please. That'd be great. Okay, let me get going. I should say at the outset, this is scheduled from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. I'm going to have to wrap up at about 5 or 10 minutes to 2 because I've got to get across campus to teach a 2 o'clock class. So if I am running a little bit out of time, we might have to shorten Q&A, but I'm happy to field any questions by email. What I want to do today is talk about the changing place of agriculture and agricultural policy within increasingly complex rural landscapes. I want to do that in a way that speaks to a diverse set of audiences, both the sort of university crowd here from geography and environmental studies, who mightn't necessarily be experts in agriculture, but know broader things, spatial planning and the use of space for economic, social and political purposes, and the bureaucrats, people from the DPI and other government agencies who might be listening online, who perhaps might have a more detailed understanding of specific policy. So I'm going to try and bridge those two audiences here today. And this talk that I'm giving today speaks to research that I've been doing in partnership with New South Wales Department of Primary Industries over the last few years through an ARC linkage grant that's referenced there. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that, yes, it's me speaking, but it's been very much a team effort with a bunch of colleagues who have been employed in this project or doing honours projects in association with this research over the last few years. So their names are on the screen and I thank them all. Okay, I'm going to start with what might appear as a controversial statement, but it's done deliberately. I'm going to say agriculture at the moment is a confused policy field, increasingly confused. I think to the general public, agricultural policy is kind of synonymous with extension. It's the idea of farmers out in the fields and a government officer providing some strategic agronomic advice about environmental cropping or livestock. That's an important part of agricultural policy, but it's not necessarily what I'm going to be talking about today here. I'm going to be asking questions about how agriculture is embedded within Australian rural landscapes, and what should the role of agricultural policy be in this very confused, conflicted, and multifaceted environment. And the two bullet points on this screen speak to, I think, this confusion, the reasons for this confusion. First is that agriculture is in diverse settings. Back in 2006, that reference that I've got on the screen there from John Holmes, he wrote about the many rurals of Australia, and it's a simplistic typology. He talks about rural spaces being productivist or consumerist or protectionist, whether it's production, consumption, or protection values predominating, and that's obviously simplistic, but it's a good opening framework to understand diversity. And I think when we often think of agricultural policy, we think of it in terms of productive landscapes, the sort of broadacre areas in, say, New South Wales as west, where there's not much competition for land except for agriculture, but increasingly a lot of the efforts and needs of policy are in more contested landscapes where either protection goals or consumption goals jostle with agriculture for land use. And I guess it's that focus that I want to attend to today. And this is most apparent in what we call multifunctional rural landscapes or transitions towards those landscapes where there is an obvious contestation. These are areas that typically, archetypically, agriculture predominated at some point in the past, but due to demographic or economic or landscape protectionist agendas, there are multiple land uses and demands for land, and this repositions agriculture within rural spaces. And I guess it's that focus on the repositioning of agriculture in rural spaces that is my focus here. So this is where I think those issues of the confusion of agricultural policy really have sharpest significance. And part of that, as I've said on the slide here, is because there is changes in landscape values, using the terminology of John Holmes there, but also within agriculture itself, there is sort of often dramatic shifts. I mean, agriculture is a dynamic sector, and there's shifts in agriculture generically as market conditions and economic forces change. But in multifunctional landscapes, what you see is because land appreciates in value so rapidly, there is more of an incentive for agricultural landholders, if they are to remain productivist, to do different things with their land to get greater values per area of land. And that involves new activities, the coupling, decoupling and recoupling of activities into new markets, the development of attributes, credence attributes around geographical indications potentially, or localism or branding. We're all aware of this, but this is part of the play of agriculture in these spaces. Going back to John Holmes, in that quote there, I think what significance he calls this a radical reordering in the three basic principles of rural land in these spaces. So I think for many of us here, this is sort of known territory. We understand these principles, but I wanted to just start off with some of those ideas to get everyone in the same headspace. Now, there's some very tangible ramifications in the social and political dimensions of rural spaces that flow from this. As agriculture is often decentered as the major economic activity in rural landscapes, you have increased capacity for land use conflict with rural populations who may have very different associations with agriculture. And I think the balance of political forces at the regional scale shifts pretty significantly. So I've got a couple of examples of that on the slide there. The tweet on the right-hand side from National Party Senator Matt Canavan from last year, I think it struck out to me at the time when I read it. I read it through the sort of farming literature at the time, where Matt Canavan essentially said, I mean, he's only one voice in the National Party, I guess, but he's a significant voice. He sort of said that the National Party's constituency in many rural areas these days were not farmers anymore. It was the resources sector and it was other interests in the economy. And that's quite a significant shift to the way we've presumed politics, rural politics in Australia has traditionally operated. It sort of opens up a sphere of debate that was kind of assumed before. And the second quote there, I mean, this is one, I could have chosen any example of this, but I chose it. Sophie Webber in the audience here in real life is telling me there's more up-to-date crises about the blueberry sector. Blueberry sector in Coffs Harbour, for those of you who know, and I know a lot of DPI people listening here know, is very controversial because it encroaches on urban areas. And this is one example of many. Yeah, pollution, spray drift, use of pollutants going into local waterways. And this has caused a lot of public consternation. And it's an issue for agricultural policy makers to contend with. The assumption that agriculture has primacy in these landscapes is not really the case necessarily anymore. Doesn't mean agriculture is not important or shouldn't be promoted, but it needs to be promoted in particularly different ways. So, yeah, in the broader sense, the macro sense, this has got something to do with the changing space of Australia, the changing place of the changing way in which our economy operates. So political scientists often coined the term agrarianism to describe domestic politics in Australia over much of the 20th century. And this was really the national ideology that said agriculture should be privileged because of its importance to empire, to trade, to food security, economic security at times of, say, war in the 20th century. And associated with that was a whole raft of concessions and subsidies for agriculture for the premise that agriculture should have a privileged place in the economy. I think we know that story. I think since the 1980s, that has shifted. And I think the sort of under the neoliberal premises that sort of governments at least assume to work under, the assumption is that agriculture is just one sector out of many and that it should be treated fairly. Fairness to one person might be different to someone else, but the idea it shouldn't necessarily be preferably treated. It should be treated as one economic activity amongst others. So at the macro level, we've seen that shift. But I think what I'm going to focus on pretty much for the rest of this presentation is how that ideology and that changing space of agriculture in regional economies fits into the planning, the architectures of planning and regulation, and what this means for the interface between people promoting agricultural policy and the needs to have instruments that support that. And I'm going to tell a story here that's, again, a little bit simplistic, but I think captures some of this transition. And this is from agricultural primacy, which is, I guess, an analogue to agrarianism I just talked about a moment ago, to something about the new rural economy, to smart ruralism, which is a term that actually hasn't been used much at all. We hear a lot about smart urbanism that I'll reference in a moment as an analogue. Stop laughing. But smart ruralism is something that, if you go to Google Scholar, you don't see that term much in use at all. There's a few papers only on it. But let me get to it. So agricultural primacy, this first quote there actually comes from a British source. That in 2006, Lapping was sort of saying that, you know, I mean, in the British case, and I think it translates to Australia pretty easily, planners tended historically to overemphasize agriculture when determining decisions about land use and regulation, kind of at the expense of sometimes when land was not in agricultural use anymore. So there was something of a lag where planners and agencies were assuming rural areas were agricultural, when in fact, perhaps the reality on the ground was quite different, but agriculture had primacy still. And I think, I guess we're sort of working through that transition still today. That sort of speaks to this idea of agriculture being a privileged sector, and in land use planning terms, priority should be given to people who farm. More recently, you know, I think a good paper by Neil Argent from UNE and Tom Neeson from CSIRO at the time, you know, they talk about the new rural economy. Again, from a planning perspective, this is simply similar to the idea of new regionalism, I guess. It's the idea of how do you support regions in an age of globalization when flows of capital and investments can shift very easily. They're globally mobile from one place or country to another. How should you plan rural regions then? And their argument pretty much is that, well, perhaps the argument here is not to privilege agriculture, but to recognise that agriculture is often place-specific because it depends on biophysical attributes linked to place. And so what you need to do, a key tool of rural development, is to say, let's protect those things that are sticky and held to the ground, and let's build from them in terms of local multipliers and extension and support. So let's not necessarily subsidise these activities per se, but let's see them as a source of local competitive advantage and build robust economies from that. Now, I think that still kind of holds, but I think where, particularly from the planning perspective, I think where the discussion is heading now is a little bit beyond that. And like I said, I've sort of I haven't coined the term smart ruralism. Don't be arrogant to say that. It's been used before, but it hasn't been used much. But the analogue smart urbanism certainly has. And that bullet point there with the quote kind of defines smart urbanism through that keyword intelligence, you know, intelligent economic, social and physical infrastructure, trying to get policy coherence in the way that we plan across different sectors to generate holistic intelligence in the way that things come together. And there's lots of discussion of that in urban contexts and lots of critique of that in urban contexts. But there hasn't been much in the rural. There hasn't been an extension much of those ideas in terms of rural planning. You can see that second quote I've got there by Scott et al. Scott et al. Scott is actually M. Scott, Mark Scott, but no relation to the Mark Scott who runs the University of Sydney. Mark Scott et al. Say, while much attention has been devoted to the impact and potential of smart cities, limited research and practice is focused on exploring the potential of new technologies for enhancing rural planning. That quote was in 2019, and from an international perspective rather than an Australian perspective, but I think there's some truth, some legitimacy in thinking about rural agriculture, agricultural policy, rural planning, that interface in these terms. So I was thinking, if we are to embrace this idea of smart ruralism, understanding its shortcomings, its technocratic nature, its attempt to depoliticize conflict, when in fact conflict might be explicit. What are some of the issues for rural planning? And these are kind of my random thoughts, I guess, at this point. I'm sort of not referring to others' work, but it seems to me that there's kind of obvious ways in which we can think of smart ruralism for place management. So when it comes to disasters, and we need real-time knowledge of forces under control. Billy Hayworth was here today, of course, did a lot of work on volunteer GIS systems in bushfire context in Tasmania back in his PhD days. And there's lots of like smart technological uses for place management in terms of crisis. And we can extend that into biosecurity hazards, weed invasions, vegetation change, land use change, changes in agricultural systems from year to year, what that implies for water demand, and also from the socio-economic perspective, the new technologies around, tracking mobilities through smartphones and credit card payment systems, and all this might be really interesting and relevant for place management purposes, particularly, I guess, in tourist destinations and the like. So we can see for place management purposes, there's a lot of applications with technology, but the question of how we might apply technology for longer term planning, for sort of smart, coherent planning to align agriculture within diverse settings, I think is a kind of more complex set of issues, and that's really where I'm going to start talking about now. So if we're going to try and think about smart rural planning, right, or something like this, the way in which we might take forward the opportunities of technology, the context of technology in complex rural landscapes. The starting point, I think, for planning is the fact that there's a dualism in the way that planning operates. Strategic planning, at least the term strategic planning, is kind of envisaging an affirmative. It's really sitting down in various forums with communities and stakeholders and trying to chart a future, a preferred future for a region, LGA or whatever scale we're looking at. And so that's affirmative or yes. It sort of poses yes questions. What do we want? Yes, we want a landscape that looks like this. But then to get to that landscape, those affirmative landscape principles, the tools are often negative. They're all about to get to this envisaged landscape, we have to stop development, we have to prohibit things, we have to manage things in a particular way. So planning operates through this dualism of affirmative and negative. I've said contradictions there, maybe it's not contradictions, maybe it's dialectic, I don't know, between the envisaging and the regulatory. And I think that's very much, when we think about the opportunities for smart ruralism or shifts in the planning regime for agriculture, I think it's the starting point is understanding this dualism. Okay, I said earlier that this presentation speaks to some pretty diverse audiences. A lot of people, I guess, online from state government institutions probably know this stuff as their bread and butter, but I thought I should sort of spell it out for other audiences around. If we were to think about this dualism in the New South Wales context, this is an extremely simplified version of the major planning instruments in New South Wales. And no one put their hand up and say, look, you've forgotten X legislation or regulation. I know there's lots missed here, but this is, in a sense, for the purposes of this paper, a simplification of what the key instruments of planning look like. Of course, there's federal government things and decisions, but from the state government perspective, the umbrella starting point is the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which sets out the broad parameters for planning to be undertaken in conjunction with other pieces of legislation, obviously. And one of the key attributes of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act is the fact that it specifies governments can set out state environmental planning policies or SEPs. And for example, there was a primary production and rural development SEP in 2019, which specified some standard instruments and rules for rural planning in the state. So with that as the umbrella legislative architecture, then departments of planning, they go through name changes every few years as government departments do, but effectively government departments of planning then set out 20-year plans at the regional level. So for example, there's an existing North Coast plan, which has a 20-year vision for strategic planning and land use across that region. So that's often broader in scope, but its intent is to then inform the ways in which local governments then make their decisions. And again, two of the key instruments that local governments use are local environmental plans and local strategic planning statements. And these two documents, speak to that yes/no dualism. The local strategic planning statements are the envisaging of what local governments might look like over a period of time, and the local environment plans do many things, but in particular, they specify, as you can see on the right of the slide here, zoning. So this is the prescriptions of what is permissible in a particular area, and also minimum lot sizes. I've circled minimum lot sizes because that's my go-to for the rest of this paper, essentially. But you can see in zoning for agricultural purposes, there are a range of zones that local governments initiate that set out a preference for agriculture. RU1, in which primary production is to be promoted, RU2, in which agriculture still be promoted, but within broader rural landscape principles. RU3 is forestry, if you're wondering, and RU4 is primary production, small lots, and there's a lot of other zones as well. But I want to focus on minimum lot sizes, probably because in this project that I've been undertaking with DPI over the last few years, which has involved a lot of stakeholder meetings and focus groups with local councils, discussion kind of centres on minimum lot sizes as the key instrument. And so I think if we're talking about the way in which agricultural planning operates, there needs to be a robust discussion of the role of minimum lot sizes. And I want to do that. Minimum lot sizes defined as this is the minimum area of land in which an owner is allowed to apply for a dwelling entitlement. They still need development consent from council to build it, but essentially it's a minimum area of land in which you can build a house, generically speaking. Okay, so I'm going to have 4 critiques of minimum lot sizes as they operate in rural New South Wales at the moment, particularly in areas like the North Coast and multifunctional landscapes. And the irony here is that minimum lot sizes are often interpreted or conflated with agricultural policy. It's like, why do we have minimum lot sizes? Oh, to promote agriculture. And I guess I'm going to say they do that kind of in ill-fitting ways, and there needs to be a reappraisal of what they do. And there's 4 elements to this argument. I'm going to say they're quintessentially negative in their implication. There's an economic incoherence in terms of the sizes of minimum lot size regulations. There's a whole bunch of exemptions which have contradicted their operation, and they get sideswiped on occasions by other government objectives, which leads to a broader set of incoherences in terms of planning. So I'll go through each of these 4 in the time I have available. So negative planning. And I've got quite a few quotes in the next few slides from government agencies, because I want to sort of, obviously what I'm saying here is not unique or original. I think this is, a lot of these critiques are perhaps well said already within government, but perhaps as an academic, as an outsider, what I can do is bring these together and add a further element of critique to them. So this first quote here, which comes from DPI from the 2022 publication, says, I think this is a really good quote. I'm sorry, I think my little portrait box in the top right-hand corner covers some of the text, but it says, The New South Wales planning framework sets clear reliance on the objectives and preferred land uses in residential, employment and conservation zones. However, rural zones can often be viewed as leftover land, where a myriad of land uses compete for land for various reasons. So, if we think about it, the kind of planning frameworks that are applied in urban residential contexts often have a lot of guidelines. There's a lot of detail on what landholders need to do with their land. But rural land, leftover land, there's not much that's said. So where there's a vacuum, there's action. Now, of course, in some cases, that rural land gets used for agriculture, of course, but the vacuum means it can be used for a whole lot of other purposes. And the negative, the sort of opening, the lack of discussion on this point means that land that is nominally justified through minimum lot sizes for agriculture simply doesn't get used for labor, doesn't get used for agriculture. And there's a bunch of reasons for that I'll specify here. One is that the minimum lot sizes are often kind of too big for rural residential purposes, but because they are minimum mandated lot sizes, owners cannot subdivide them with the view of subdividing them, selling them for other people to build houses on. So they're stuck with one house on a large lot. And what do they do with the excess land? One local government official who we talked to in the North Coast kind of coined the term grassy deserts, which apart from being sort of contradictory in a biogeographical sense, is kind of interesting, because what it means is you've got these houses and leftover unused land around them that is not really used for agriculture because the owners are not farmers, but they're just empty spaces. And this is sort of ironically in these areas where land prices are at a premium, you get a lot of underutilized or unused land, which I think is interesting. Secondly, because owners can't subdivide, there's an incentive for owners to try and wheedle their way through the planning system to develop new dwellings on their land without contradicting minimum lot size regulations. And one of these tactics that's used is arguments in favour of dual occupancy. Now, this is different local governments have different policies on dual occupancy. This is basically building another dwelling or another another residential or other structure on the land without subdividing it. So you can't sell it off as two different lots, but you can sell off a lot with two buildings on it. As I said, local councils have different views on this, but I think what's interesting here, and I think this is really interesting, is the whole debate on dual occupancy. Kind of, okay, a landowner, if they get permission from council, can build another dwelling on their land under certain, if they get development consent, if they go through the hoops. That was sort of okay, but in the Airbnb era, it's a potential gold mine, because once you get a second dwelling on a lot, it's not like, how do we find someone to rent it? You know, it's globally advertised. It's on a platform. So this is, I think, shifted the economics around dual occupancy quite significantly. We're seeing this up the North Coast. I've got a slide in a moment to show that. I think also underutilised land has a lot of classic agricultural contradictions, particularly around invasive weeds, biosecurity and bushfire, and DPI and other government agencies do a lot about this. They're very concerned that rural residential landowners in agricultural areas kind of just don't manage their land, and that threatens farmland and adjacent properties. That's legitimate concern. I think also, I talked about grassy deserts with unused land, and a lot of landholders, particularly up the far North Coast, on these oversized lots, say, what are we going to do with it? Let's revegetate. Let's bring it back to natural ecosystems, which is great. And there's very much, I guess, a sort of an alternative environmental culture up the North Coast where a lot of landowners kind of want to do this, and that's great. But often, as local governments told us in our focus groups, those aspirations, which council doesn't really have any problem with, are sometimes poor in their execution, and landholders revegetate with the wrong types of trees and plants. This causes a whole lot of other implications for local ecosystems, which is, I'll talk about this in a moment. I'll flag an example of that in Lismore in a moment. And then we've got, once land is revegetated, if people are not doing it for ideological or lifestyle reasons, they might want to earn some cash over it through then claiming it for offsets purposes, either for carbon or biosecurity offsets. And I think I've just said on the slide, there poses new challenges which policies are lagging. I know the state government is doing a lot in terms of trying to think through carbon farming and biodiversity offsets, but from a planning perspective, it's a bit unclear how it fits into this. So here's an example of this around Lismore, around the hills in Lismore. There's a lot of revegetation going on by non-farming rural landholders, and the local government there has been quite active in trying to set out educational tools to encourage landowners to revegetate in ways that are consistent with broader ecosystem logics. But again, this is land that was previously agriculture, which is coming back in complex way, coming out of agriculture in complex ways. Here's an example that sort of speaks to the Airbnb issue. And we were struck by this in some meetings in Kyogle when we ran some focus groups. Kyogle is just north of Lismore, for those of you who don't know. And the photo there is actually comes from an accommodation, a rural accommodation website. And I think, I don't know, but the local informants we had in the focus group were really, they sort of pinpointed the issues really well. They sort of said, well, traditionally a lot of this area was dairying. It's sort of the bottom went out of the dairy sector a few decades ago. There was still dairying there. You can see dairy cows in this photo, for example. But there's a lot less dairying. But there's a lot of the heritage dairying landscape that's still there. A lot of these houses like this, classic North Coast dairy farmer houses, with a bit of strategic renos, extremely well suited for Airbnb rentals at massive prices. And owners can earn typically a lot of money out of this, sometimes more than they can from the surrounding farming activities. I thought there's a couple of quotes on this slide which I grabbed from our field notes. Someone said, well, you know, owners coming in wanting to repurpose land are after three things: trees, some creek, and an elevated clear building site. So if they're not, you know, renovating a property, they're building a property like that. And I think this last comment sort of, again, it speaks to a fair bit of the sort of what's been spoken about in rural sociology for many years about the pluriactivity and of farming and the importance of off-farm income sources for farmers. But one of our blokes in Kyogle said, most farmers have side hustles, which I thought probably summarised better the issue than probably, I don't know, 100 academic articles written on the topic over the last 20 years. So you've got this reimagining of the landscape going on. So what can agricultural policy do in these contexts where you've got leftover land that's nominally agricultural, that's going into new purposes? Well, I don't think prohibiting new rural owners from alternative land uses is viable in a democracy such as Australia. But I think there is a role in terms of promoting land that's used for agriculture, for highly productive agriculture, and trying to alert other areas of government the importance of this agricultural land in future ways. So, for example, in the last year or two, the state government through DPI has been trying to map state significant agricultural land. This is a very complex process because there's lots of variables at hand. But the idea is that if state significant agricultural land is mapped, it can then be inserted as an advisory in the next round of local strategic planning statements, and local governments and regional plans can accommodate land and perhaps fill in some of these gaps in this leftover land concept. At least that's the theory. The problem here, as I've said in the bottom bullet point there, is there's very weak legislative teeth here. The role of DPI in planning context is very much an advisory role to promote agriculture, but not to create dictates that might impact on other planning concerns. Okay, so the story I've told so far, I guess, is the fact that minimum lot sizes are often too large, and in these vacuum contexts are being filled in by other purposes, not necessarily agricultural, and that causes a whole lot of planning debates and policy debates. I guess an assumption, an unsaid assumption so far, has been that these minimum lot sizes, if they weren't used for agriculture, might typically be the best size to run a farm. And that's kind of absolutely not the case. there's an extraordinary randomness to the size of minimum lot sizes. You would imagine that a minimum lot size, if zoned for agriculture, is kind of what someone might suggest is the minimum size to operate a viable farm. But in fact, minimum lot sizes are really a historical product of some incoherent, contradictory decisions at different times by different councils across the state that don't reflect at all anything about the economics of agriculture. Now, the New South Wales Agriculture Commissioner, in a report last year, made this point. He said they're historical, they're not based on evidence, and New South Wales DPI has said the same thing. Minimum lot sizes do vary, but the most common, particularly in multifunctional rural areas in New South Wales, is a 40-hectare edict. So in much of the areas that I'm talking about, outside of towns and villages, the presumption is you've got 40 hectares, you can't subdivide it more and expect to build a house on that 40 hectares. So minimum 40 hectares is the minimum. And through my research, I kind of asked a couple of people over time, where did this come from? Where did 40 hectares come from? And I remember memorably, one of our informants said, well, it used to be 100 acres, which roughly translates. Australians are all into 100. You know, when a chess cricketer scores a century, it's like, oh, you got the century, you know. So Australians are really into 100. So 100 acres became the rule. And I thought that's a little bit whimsical, but it's about as good as logic as I could find. It comes from 1973. Next year, this decision is 50 years old. So we're basically planning the state based on a decision that was randomly made almost 50 years ago. Now, I tracked down the actual decision. This came from a circular put out by the State Planning Authority on the 19th of April, 1973, thanks to Mary Kovac from DPI, who got me a copy of this. And I actually went into the University of Sydney's library storage, and they provided me with the original paper version. So I've actually seen it. But anyway, the State Planning Authority kind of said we want to stop subdivisions in rural areas. So we're going to dictate 40 hectares as the minimum lot size for rural areas. Councils can go above that if they're out in the west of the state or something like that. 40 hectares is the minimum. And bizarrely, to I guess our thinking, like in the current time, they said, well, that's the minimum size you can build a dwelling, so long as that's occupied by someone involved in agriculture. This is an absurdly unenforceable planning provision. You can't say you're allowed to build a house so long as that house is occupied by someone working in agriculture. It makes no sense. It's unenforceable. It makes no sense at all. And it also said, oh, well, we know this is more restrictive than the sort of more laissez-faire history in the past. So we'll give farmers a concession. If they want to subdivide their property less than 40 hectares, they can put in an application for what was called a concessional lot, and they can build a house on that, so long again as that house is occupied by someone involved in farming. As I said, absurdly unenforceable policy, as I'll suggest in a moment. This was so controversial at the time, the State Planning Authority then, after making this initial circular in April, had to put out a second circular in November, which says, and I've highlighted in red text there, the key point, it sort of said, we're specifying 40 hectares, we know it's arbitrary, but what we want to do is use this as a starting point for a policy that aligns minimum lot sizes to agricultural potential. And they say, this needs a great deal of research, but it is hoped that this method will be applied in future planning schemes. 50 years later, we're still waiting. You know, there's lots of research on agricultural viability, lots of reports into rural land, but there has never been an explicit alignment of minimum lot size regulations to agricultural viability. So this is the map of 40 hectare minimum lot sizes in New South Wales at the moment. Most of the, and 40 hectare areas are in blue. Most of the rural areas outside of that is larger than 40 hectares. But you can see here that there's 40 hectares along the North Coast, Southern Highlands, Blue Mountains, Central West, Upper Hunter, Riverina. You know, the circumstances of agriculture in the Riverina are entirely different than in Tweed and Byron, yet you've got this one catch-all instrument that seeks to regulate it on that basis, in part because there's been no research to develop a better process. I mentioned earlier this 1973 regulation said farmers can, you know, subdivide their property for a house lot. This is called a concessional lot policy. By 2008, the state government said this has been an abject failure. It doesn't support agriculture at all. So in the rural CEP of 1980 to 2008, it abolished that principle. But there are some landholders, there are many landholders who may have had that entitlement prior to 2008 and perhaps didn't act on it. And for these legacy purposes, those entitlements may still remain valid if they took it to court and be allowed to subdivide their land. Local governments don't really have a great sense of how much land is involved. So it could be the case that a local government is making a decision about land use. It might be providing a development consent for some form of intensive agriculture with a whole bunch of spray drift and other implications. And then the farmer next door says, well, I'm going to enact my historical legacy concessional lot entitlement, and has the right to build a house right next to what is an inappropriate area for residential construction. So councils have been on the back foot in this, and they're only now introducing sunset clauses to try and get rid of these provisions, but it's been a huge problem for councils over the years. Finally, this is the fourth of my last critiques, and I'll finish up in the next few minutes, is the idea of this metaphor I've been using of a vacuum being filled by all these other competing land uses and policymakers not really being able to manage agriculture as a result, manage it as effectively as they might, or as a result. I don't want to criticise policymaking efforts. Is, on occasion, state governments say, well, we want to promote or advance some other sector of the economy, whether this be coal seam gas or some other sector. And so therefore, we're going to introduce a whole lot of other planning regulations, which might contradict everything that I've spoken about so far. So this is an example just from a few months ago, where the state government brought in a new legislative instrument, a standard instrument through amending LEPs for agritourism. And this new order facilitates rural landowners to get consent for agritourism developments on their land. Agritourism sometimes supports agriculture, like for cellar doors or roadside stalls or farm gate sales. These things are in support of agriculture. But there's also some examples of agritourism that are not really agri, they're more rural tourism, they're rural amenity. And so land that might be agricultural gets facilitated into land use conversions into tourism purposes, like items 3 and 4 on that slide there. I was thinking about this, the word glamping is in legislation now, and I was wondering, Joe Gillespie here, legal geographer, we need to know whether the word glamping has ever been used in a legislative context ever before. I suspect not, but it's in New South Wales legislation now. Okay, this is my last slide and I'll finish up here. I focused on minimum lot sizes because that's traditionally been the major tool used to try and promote and manage agriculture. And as I've said, it's been used in ways that are on the no rather than the yes side of strategic planning, trying to limit subdivision, but at the same time not really saying what can be done in the land. And I think if we were to apply those arguments to this emerging idea of smart ruralism, this embryonic idea of smart ruralism, analoguing smart urbanism, and we say, well, how can technology be used to better understand principles and come up with planning tools that are less prescriptive and more proactive in terms of managing rural land in ways that don't necessarily privilege agriculture, but allow it to be fitted into complex rural landscapes better. It seems to me that there's a lot of data gaps, a lot of information gaps that can be usefully filled. Things like documenting when there's land ownership change, what those new owners do to the land. We don't have data on that really at all. Through the project I've been doing with DPI, we have data on the rate at which rural land changes hands and the types of land changing hands, but we don't really have those stories of how the change in ownership of land is then implicated with changes in land use, whether new forms of agriculture or non-agricultural forms. We need to then link that to existing planning instruments and work out how contradictions with planning might impact on people's decisions over land. And we want to open up those black boxes. And I think we've got the data sets there. It's just a matter of bringing them together and having some overarching, bigger than a single council perspective to bring them into regional plans, strategic local planning statements and the like. Okay, thanks for that. That's my last slide. I might finish it there. Thank you. And I said to people at the beginning of this presentation, I've got to be across, I'm a university lecturer, I need to be across campus for a class at 2 o'clock. So I've got to leave here by about 5:02. Jamie, yeah.
I think we have a I think what it's doing with smart rules with and I think actually have those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then it's not just Airbnb, although I would say that Airbnb is perhaps more even than in cities.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
other parts of the world where Airbnb is really but we also have kinds of reports and campaigns to kind of connect consumers across space into rural areas.
Yeah. So I've just
And recruit that.
okay. I've just got a problem here there. People online can't really hear the question. We don't have a roving mic. Apologies for that. So Sophie Webber here has just asked how we might link smart ruralism to platform economies. So platform economy is the idea of technologies that link sites of activity, or how do you define platform economies?
Sharing things as a service.
Sharing things as a service. Thanks, Sophie, for that good definition. So Airbnb being a classic example. But no, I think that's right. I think Airbnb is just one example of many. I could think of, I mean, the offsets market, water trading, biodiversity conservation practices. All these things have an element of platform economics around them. People buying claims into a landscape to get the biodiversity or carbon credits and the like. And I think this really changes the way in which rural economies operate, both in the human and the physical geography sides, absolutely. And I think prospectively, that's kind of what I'm saying here. There's a need to perhaps connect some of that debate on cities and smart urbanism and platform economies into rural contexts where I think planners are doing very appropriate things, but perhaps not with the most up-to-date tools that are available and the most up-to-date conceptions of the rural that we might be developing. So yeah, thanks. I'm just going to, sorry, Jamie, I know you're the chair. I'm just seeing if there's any other. There's a couple of questions in the room here, but if anyone on Zoom wants to ask questions, please do that. Maybe Joe and Jeff, I don't know. Yeah.
This is been trying to make it.
Yeah.
And it has not been, and it's not been set for one particular way, and that's around unconventional gas. So, you know, I thought, you know, I think it's a really good idea about how do we tackle privacy and the landscape on floors and the nice cities, but we have this absolutely entrenched problem, particularly around unconventional gas.
Yeah.
And agricultural landscapes. You know, what they do in Queensland, that's that being used, they will get agricultural land, and it's been where you come.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just paraphrase that for the audience online. So Joe Gillespie here is asking questions about what do we do with state significant land once we've mapped it, using the Queensland example where she said it's been trumped by mining, gas interests. Yeah. Which kind of speaks to that other slide where I said, well, you've got agricultural policy potentially being trumped by agritourism interests. I mean, I think The issue at the moment is, the government in New South Wales is doing a lot of good work in terms of mapping and identifying state significant agricultural land, which is great. But until there is the political will in cabinet, I don't think it's an individual minister, it's going to be a cabinet basis to actually convert these principles into something of the nature of a new set that dictates requirements on local planners. You're not going to have any progress. But I think, so at the moment, I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So at what point do we say, go back from the neoliberal premises of we're not privileging any sector to saying, in normative terms, agriculture needs to be protected, and here are the tools. And I'll still stand by everything I said. Some sort of smart evidence-based policy needs to be central to that argument. Yeah. Jeff, did you have a question?
Seems like the technology definitely been going on there, Bill. I mean,
Yeah.
The problems with minimum lot size
Yeah.
seem to be technological problems,
No, that's right.
and then the access to the smart rural solutions.
Yeah.
Is that actually going to?
Yeah. So yeah.
It didn't seem to be a technological problem.
Yeah. So Jeff Nielsen here is asking whether I'm putting too much faith in technology and smart ruralism because the examples I gave were not really problems of technology. And yeah, I'd agree. I certainly wouldn't want to fetishize technology. I mean, the smart urbanism literature tells us that, you can't just take away political conflict. Basically, it's a mask. It can provide a mask and a legitimacy to that, but it doesn't necessarily take that away. So the examples I gave there's still conflicts in the real world, in the real political economy of agriculture and land use, right? People with resources, land and otherwise, wanting to do something, and where is the contests of planning? Where does that? If putting up glamping tents generates a higher income to a landowner than running cows over that land, that's a real political economy issue that won't be resolved through smart ruralism necessarily. But I think the issue that I've confronted is that we have lots and lots of data, but we don't necessarily link that together. So we don't actually know what's happening in the rural landscape. We have lots of anecdotes. Local councils often do landholder surveys and things like that. So we get bits and pieces of information in particular parts of the economy. We don't get a holistic vision of that. And I guess you're right, technology won't solve that. But as a researcher, what I'd say is if you build together those pictures of what's happening in the rural economy, you can then use it to, if not resolve those problems, at least to articulate them in perhaps better ways. It's a half-assed answer, I know. I've probably got to go now, so I apologise because I need to go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thanks everyone for coming. Before I come, we've got a postcard section with Sandra and then.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone online too, and feel free to drop me an email if you've got any questions about that. Thanks. Thanks, James. Yeah.